Welcome to the How Good Innovation Online series. I'm Ethan Soloviev, Chief Innovation Officer at How Good. This series focuses on biodiversity, regenerative agriculture, and planetary health. We sort of switch between them, and today we're going to focus in on biodiversity and scaling biodiversity. We have a bunch of awesome talks coming up, including back in the regenerative agriculture space. We're going to take a look at regenerative fiber with Rebecca Burgess from Fibershed. A couple folks, colleagues from General Mills, are going to join us to talk about advancing regeneration on larger scale annual agriculture, tillage, row crop systems, what they're learning there. Then we'll swap over and head to packaging, looking at regenerative packaging with Jane Franch from NUMI. And then a really great session coming up in August with Jesse Smith and Lauren Tucker from the White Buffalo Land Trust, who have been doing some amazing product development around biodiversity, around regenerative agriculture, and they're doing a huge regenerative agriculture centered demonstration farm in Southern California that I think they will likely talk about as well. So that's what's coming up. Please join us for that. Invite colleagues and friends. Today, we're going to look at scaling biodiversity with Tyler Gage, currently at Terrafertil, but the co-founder of Runa, and I imagine we'll hear a bit about both today. The basic structure is these introductions. Tyler and I will talk for 35 minutes or so. Then we'll do some quick interactive community breakouts. So you meet somebody else who's here, talk a bit about the conversation, develop your questions, and then we'll come back together for Q&A to wrap up the hour, and we will be done on time. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to stop sharing. Welcome, Tyler. Just get us started. What's Runa? What's Terrafertil? What's the difference between them? What are you working on now? Give us a little overview here.
So a quick story on Runa. I started it right out of college with my friend Dan. We saw an opportunity to bring a rare Amazonian leaf called guayusa to the US market. It's a very caffeinated leaf. It grows in the upper Amazon in Ecuador. It's a cousin of yerba mate. They're both in the Ilex genus. Yerba mate's Ilex paraguariensis and guayusa's Ilex guayusa, believe it or not. And I had spent a few years studying indigenous languages and ethnobotany down in the rainforest. And probably like a lot of people on this call, kind of got the itch and saw the puzzle pieces that unless you can create economic opportunities, a lot of the cultural preservation work and conservation ideals are pretty challenging to implement. So we came up with the idea of building a value chain for guayusa and then creating some types of beverage products that were extremely poorly conceived of at the time we wrote an undergraduate business plan. My degree's in literary arts, so the business plan probably sounded great, albeit was likely highly off the mark in terms of reality. Part of what interested us in guayusa, and I think one way it's an interesting case study in this broader world, is that no one had ever commercially produced guayusa. So pretty different than the stories of things like yerba mate or acai, coconut water, these ingredients that were massive industries and supply chains in other countries that then had made the leap to the US. In Ecuador, when we started talking to the indigenous communities, the Amazonian Quechua were the primary group that we work with, and said, hey, we want to pay cash to buy these leaves and then export them and sell them to the US. They would just give us these blank stares and then start laughing hysterically because they thought it was a huge joke. Even within Ecuador, there's basically no commercial trade, commercial production. It was very much a staple plant for this one specific group for the most part and a couple other tribes. That caught our eye largely because of the innovation opportunity, right? I mean, it's pretty rare to have a crop like that doesn't have some existing commercial structure and or some norm of agricultural production. So rather than taking the 9,000 pound gorilla of like a cacao or a coffee supply chain that has its whole history and pretty entrenched injustice, it was a blank slate. So from square one, we essentially got to put the flag in the ground of having it 100% grown by farming families, 100% grown in biodiverse agroforestry plots, and then all managed through cooperatives in a fair trade structure. So, and I can talk as much about this later on as people want, but it was a lot of work to design that whole system from scratch. I mean, even the basics, like which leaves do you harvest? How do you export anything from Ecuador? I mean, all of it, we had to do a lot of
let me pause and just go into one little thing there
Yeah.
because it is focused on biodiversity. What does biodiversity even look like in the ecosystem where guayusa grows? And is the cultivation of it, or as it changed and grew towards a more commercial scale cultivation, did that change what biodiversity looked like around it? Is it still cultivated the same way? Just give us a bit of an image so we can sort of see what agroforestry biodiverse systems look like there.
For sure. And please continue to like interject good questions like that, as I, probably am too high level or too specific on certain things. So, so it's an interesting situation with the Quechua in particular, because their traditional farming essentially is agroforestry. So they have these different tiers of forest management that largely are cutting and burning down a section of rainforest and then strategically managing growth. So you walk around, in Quechua they call them chacras. You walk around a chacra, there's 50 to 150 functional plants, whether it's hardwoods through medicinal plants, all in this area, that they essentially like burn down a quarter acre, and then they just pruned essentially and kind of strategically let certain species grow to rebuild this productive forest. So the concept of agroforestry is inherent to how they do any farming of any sort. So it wasn't introducing a new way of thinking about production. I think the real innovation in our model was putting a commercial component into that existing framework. So for them, it was very, historically, those systems are focused on autonomy, right? So they need to grow the shipati for the roof of their huts. They need the chontan, the different hardwoods for a bunch of different uses. And they would have like 1 or 2 guayusa trees. Because for a family to brew strong guayusa, you don't need, 300 trees in a hectare. So a lot of our work was basically creating a thicker layer of guayusa amidst the chacras. You think about it, there was like 4 meters between a plant. So not dense by any stretch, 16 feet-ish. 12, that would be 12, wouldn't it?
Also
yeah. So relatively sparsed out, but essentially trying to give an economic sustenance to that system. So as these farmers, and the farmers that we work with, just to be clear, these are not hyper remote communities. We could really only work with communities that already have a road access. Mm-hmm. And generally, at least in the Amazon, once a road reaches a community, that's probably the single biggest influence in the history of their world.
Right.
So these are all communities that are pretty inextricably linked to commerce and modernity in some form or fashion. So for us, we were trying to give them a way to use their baseline relationship to the rainforest, but give it enough of a commercial value to sustain that system, as opposed to burning the whole thing down and trying to grow corn, or just extracting all the hardwood they can, which they've pretty much done in the first place, and don't have a lot of future there, or just selling the farm, moving to the city.
It's really interesting that you mentioned autonomy. It's one of the questions I was going to ask, so I'm just going to jump to it. Here we are in a week that in the United States is about independence, or some say interdependence, but independence for most. And so I was thinking about independence, and like the question sort of like, what was the effect on the independence of what is ongoingly the effect of the independence on the communities that you've worked with and engaged with there around guayusa? Did it increase it, or did it push against a little bit that autonomy you were talking about? How did that work, and how is it continuing to, or where would you want it to go if it's not quite where you're hoping now?
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about the word resiliency. It's probably lots of us are familiar with throwing out lots of development jargon, but resiliency is big for us in the work that we do, mostly through our nonprofit. For me, I've always said that if there was a global pandemic, or the shit were to really hit the fan globally, albeit there's a lot of challenges of being a Quechua farmer in the Amazon, that's a pretty darn autonomous lifestyle. Like, when their bridges wash out and X, Y, and Z, absolutely things like emergency medicine access they can't get, which is challenging. Some of their access to education and markets, that can all be compromised. But they live off the land pretty well. And they, even despite lots of evolutions in their own livelihoods over the last 500 years, they can live off the land pretty well. And most of these communities still have a base of self-sustenance. So for us, the idea has never been to make them dependent upon a market economy whatsoever, and especially not to make them dependent upon one crop. So, in our, even some specific things, in our agreements with farmers, we mandate that we won't buy from anyone who takes down primary forest, or even established secondary growth forests to grow guayusa. And our technical team is very well trained in making sure that they had various income sources and diversified streams so that they weren't dependent upon one crop or even the full market economy per se. So I think that was pretty key to how we approached supporting them to maintain that autonomy, but then giving them enough economic resources so they could, be the leaders of their own destiny and, cross a certain poverty threshold that would keep them away from emergency medicine and things like that.
So I kind of interrupted a little bit ago. You were on the track of this story, but keep going. Like, how did you started out, you wrote this plan, you told them you wanted to buy it, they laughed at you, but some of them did sell. At some point along the way, you worked to grow the scale of what you were doing. Had you had commercial success selling, the beverages or whatever that you created? What was the sort of step-by-step that led to a real scaling around the sort of biodiverse system around the guayusa?
Yeah, so maybe a preface thought to that, which is probably relevant in terms of how we think about guayusa as a crop, as some of the components it has that made it pretty high potential for both business success and a functioning regenerative system. So a few benefits for farmers: being a leaf and just the nature of the crop, you can harvest 365 days. So one benefit from a farmer perspective and why they were interested is it's not something that just once a year, and this can be problematic for cacao and coffee where it's just a couple times a year. Potentially 99% of a family's income is going to come, which can have a lot of risk associated. So it spaces the income out. It's a pretty quick crop cycle as well. That's the other key thing, is with some hardwoods or longer cycle crops, even cacao, depending how you grow it, when you start pushing 4, 5, 6 years from planting something to having your first harvest, that's a longer period of time for a farmer to imagine and really invest in. With guayusa, within 2.5 to 3.5 years, you're getting your first harvest, and maybe a bit sooner. So for them, they can cycle things like yucca and plantains for a solid 2.5 years, and then the guayusa comes on the tail of it. So that was a good bridge in terms of commercial viability. It also grows better in the shade. So another great piece of the crop where just its botanical properties and sort of biological nature grows much better under the shade of some degree of canopy. So in terms of how we got the pieces going, we often say we took a liberal arts approach to entrepreneurship because that's pretty much all we knew. So essentially we moved to the middle of the Ecuadorian Amazon like 2 days after graduating and just started talking to anybody and everybody we could. Part of our thesis was trying to use this leaf and its sort of its way of working in the Quechua culture as our business model. I didn't mention this, but in the Quechua culture, the whole community gets up at 3 a.m. They boil these huge clay pots full of guayusa. As I mentioned, it's very caffeinated, and they sit around and tell stories, interpret dreams, and it sort of weaves this fundamental relationship between the people, and not just the community, but then their environment and ancestors and dreams and many, many layers to it. So we basically said, well, this plant seems like it has this very convivial, interactive spirit to it. So if we just sit down and drink guayusa with lots of communities and meet with all the regional government people and nonprofits and national government people and just start asking questions and understand the situation, that would carry us forward, which ultimately it did. We built lots of partnerships, asked a lot of questions. Our first big break, practically speaking, of like, okay, that's all nice to ask questions, but then how do you actually fund something and make it happen? We got a $50,000 grant from the export ministry in Ecuador to build our first test facility. So we got our first drying machine to dry the leaves, a little mill. It was all super rustic, but that gave us our real first clip forward to saying, okay, we can actually buy leaves, process them, pack them, and export, albeit 20 kilos at a time. And then from there, it was a lot of just weaving together funding both on the nonprofit and for-profit side, which I could speak to some more as well if you wanted.
Yeah, and when did you start actually selling the product, and how did it kind of go on the exponential scale that you must have taken as Runa grew and eventually exited? What were some of the kind of key things that pushed that along, and how did you maintain your understanding of what basically sounds like you understood the essence of the plant, of the leaf, of the communities that it came from, and yet you then sort of put it into motion towards scaling very quickly? So what were some of the key steps in that, and then how did you keep the integrity of your relationships with the community, of your relationships with the plant, in the face of a sort of what in many cases would be seen as sort of like a capitalist venture success story.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was always the tricky part, right? Like within Runa, we had this kind of like high growth, businessy, venture mindset approach, advisors, people in our head in one ear, and then this like very rootsy, regenerative mindset on the other. And overall, we balanced that relatively well in some veins, and there was just huge amounts of friction in terms of difficulties managing those threads, which I could talk about probably for hours. Practically speaking, just in terms of the quick nuts and bolts of how we did it, we originally launched as a loose leaf tea because that was the easiest thing to do. We could just arm a horrendous website and force our friends and family to buy swaggy, poorly produced Guayusa. Then we launched tea bags because that was also easier to do. That was probably 2011 we launched our tea bags. And then it was like 2013-ish we launched the ready to drink, which we knew would really be the ultimate format. A couple key things there is, and Ethan, you've talked about this a bit, but I think a lot of brands tend to be too direct and literal with how they translate what a product means in its original context with what it can mean in a new context. And for us, we weren't trying to tell a story. We were trying to create direct economic impact for these communities. So ultimately, when we started selling the loose leaf tea, for us, it was all about the story and this tea ceremony and the spirit of the plant. And pretty quickly, we realized that what most consumers cared about was this sustained energy benefit and this kind of pretty unique focus that Guayusa gives you. And whether someone was buying the product because they felt this, deep spiritual connection to the Quechua people, or if they were just chugging a can of Runa before a workout and had no clue where it came from, the concrete impact was exactly the same. So, of course, we, by no means would want to be disrespectful to the plant or twist it in a way which was inauthentic. But fundamentally, we needed to translate what this product could mean in the hands of consumers, which was then going to drive impact through the supply chain that we built. And we didn't necessarily need to tell everyone how we were doing things if it wasn't the strongest calling card. So that was very fundamental to how we thought about product development and sales in somewhat a very disjunct way from we thought about supply chain development. And I see a lot of entrepreneurs and groups trying to merge the two unnecessarily.
Can you say just a little more about that? It sounds like some interesting sort of insight. Don't give away any secrets, but what is it that you figured out there that you see others sort of making a mistake with?
It pretty much is fundamentally that storytelling ultimately doesn't create impact, right? Like any amazing marketing campaign that shows the faces of the farmers, et cetera, those can be great things, and there's no issue with any of that. But in this work, dollars are really what matters, right? Like these farmers essentially need income. It's very well proven you can put, cash in these farmers' pockets, and that raises their standard of living on pretty much every frontier. So your goal as a sales and marketing person needs to be, how do I get this product out there at the largest scale possible? Again, in a way which then doesn't deteriorate the original mission and functioning of a regenerative value chain. So for us, that was a lot of the work towards the energy drink, of recognizing that selling a clean, from a leaf, not a lab, great tasting alternative energy drink with its range of functionality was a much stronger selling point. When again, on the surface, someone might say, that's so far from the roots. Like, how could you carbonate this leaf and put it in a can and add these flavors? That's not in integrity to the spirit of this plant. To me also, these cultures are constantly evolving. That's a big piece of, especially in the Amazon, trade is everything. I could go on about that, but so the brand name Runa is actually a Quechua word, which means many things, but one of the things it means is fully alive, or a person that really embodies a fully expressed version of what it means to be alive. And for them, that means many things. Part of it means responsible livelihood and supporting your community. Part of it means a harmonious relationship to your environment. And one of the definitions is to know other cultures. And the Quechua in particular are very intercultural. Their whole identity is knowing other tribes and languages and plants from other people, and their sense of what it means to be a Quechua person is partly embedded in this sort of intercultural framework. I tend to be on the side of things that I think thinking about these like kind of fixed, rigid, this has always been this way in the Amazon is like generally pretty off. Even if you want to go back, like every farmer we work with that is Quechua was Shiwiar, Zapara, Achuar, Shuar 500 years ago before the Incans came and colonized them and made them Quechua. So it's like there's so many evolutionary twists and turns. And, again, I'm by no means saying we should, twist or appropriate or, bash any of these traditions. I think it's more, for us, it was what's the core spirit of what this plant is? What's the core relationship they have? And how can we honor that spirit in a way which might look different to the consumers who interact with it? So
Right.
maybe like to summarize it, it's like it's not just throwing away the past, but it's saying rather than really focusing on what it looks like on the surface in this culture origin point, how can I think about what's the relationship, what's that core meaning, and then translate that in a way which has a similar relationship to other people, but on the surface probably looks a bit different. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. You went deeper than the sort of surface representation of it and to the core process, the core spirit that was inside of it. I also remember you talking about a particular statement that you and the company had that was like 7 words and only 7 words that was in this direction that helped guide some of these decisions that you made towards the sort of economic viability and why you would scale and market and sell a bunch of this drink in order to achieve this back for the farmers. So maybe you can talk about, I don't remember what it was. I just remember it was 7 words and it can't be more than that. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so one of our mentors from the Mulago Foundation, who's, if you guys don't know them, they do some really incredible funding work, basically has this thing that any organization should have a 7-word mission statement. And I've translated that a bit. I think any project, even within a big company, you could have a specific regenerative project that could have like a mission statement that's really your core guiding light. And the challenge is to summarize that in 7 words. I think lots of us have heard these, verbose, and again, any of us in this kind of development world can get very jargony very quickly. So the goal is to summarize what is the key thing you're trying to do in as simple language as possible in 7 words. So for us, it became improving livelihoods for Amazonian families. And again, you could say livelihoods is relatively jargony, but for us, that meant income, right? We knew that if we could concretely put meaningful, sustained dollars in these farmers' hands, that's the most empowered place they could invest in their own future. And part of it for us, there was this other layer that it wasn't just income. In the Quechua context, like money is not livelihood, money is not how you fulfill this idea of being Runa, but it was doing it in a way which was sustainable, regenerative, and sort of gave them a relationship to the land, which they don't have through really any other economic means.
And so was that able to stay intact even as Runa grew and grew and then I think was acquired? Maybe talk a bit about that story and how did you sort of keep the integrity of the work that you had developed even, when Runa was no longer its own entity, but one that was owned by a much larger one?
So twofold. And a lot of it just comes back down to business basics. Right. So in the fact that out of the gate, we designed and built this whole supply chain to depend on farming families. That's where the volume came from. We helped plant like 1.2 million trees on indigenous farmers' land. So yeah, theoretically you could come along and just write all of that off and rebuild everything from complete scratch. But we sort of created this weight and momentum in that original structure of the production system and commercial relationships. That's one. 2, albeit I mentioned we sort of led a lot of brand communication from this product centrist point of view. We also did obviously a lot to tell that deeper story of where this plant came from and that kind of base of the pyramid of that communication hierarchy. So we lead with product functionality, taste, that sort of easy, digestible bits. But then we focused a lot on bigger PR stories to tell the full weight of what we were doing and how we worked. So again, from that perspective, it kind of makes it difficult as a brand to sort of sever that past and that expectation from consumers. Those are probably the 2 main pieces. I think you could also get into a whole conversation about, is monocrop agriculture even more efficient? I think you could get into a long conversation if you look at the history of supply chains in Latin America of, is that actually a safer, more efficient strategy of production for a bunch of reasons? So yeah, so I don't think there's even necessarily like a sound argument to say it would be more profitable to just buy 50 acres of land and burn it all down and monocrop guayusa in the first place. Um,
It's
and
amazing. I
part,
mean,
yeah.
so, sorry, like just going on that, do you see other opportunities you've taken a plant that grows in a biodiverse setting in agroforestry systems, indigenous smallholders, working with them closely. Is there opportunity that you scaled up the production, manufacturing of that crop, but can this business model in general scale? Are there more crops like this that it can happen with? Can we have this sort of support for economic livelihoods through indigenous agroforestry, biodiverse practices? Can that scale?
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see opportunities there?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll try and combine that with just where are we now in terms of what happened to Runa, and as quickly as I can. So essentially, we sold the Runa. So Runa's always been half nonprofit, half for-profit. We started the foundation, Runa Foundation, and the brand simultaneously, and had a kind of unique relationship between the two. We sold the company to Vita Coco, large coconut water brand. On that side, they manage the largest coconut supply chain in the world. Another unique tropical product, working with lots of farming families in many countries, in many contexts. So on the one hand, it might not seem obvious, the familiarity of the work, but actually quite a bit of understanding they had in terms of how to operate those supply chains. They're incredibly skilled operators. They're more businessy than maybe we were, in terms of our orientation. But because we translated our regenerative structure into pretty sound business principles, it made sense to them more from a business angle, and the supply chain really hasn't changed under their stewardship. On the nonprofit side, we merged Runa Foundation with another community development group in Ecuador. And essentially, we're doing what you just mentioned. So the nonprofit's called Aliados, Aliados. And we essentially are an incubator and funder of innovative regenerative value chains in community enterprises. So working on everything from super early stage, some native Amazonian vanilla and other vanilla species in the Peruvian Amazon. We work on the largest goldenberry supply chains in the world in Ecuador and Colombia with a few thousand farmers in the Andes. We incubated and spun out an Andean mezcal company. Actually, in Ecuador, there's this incredible tradition of these Andean Quechua communities and these women that make this super unique Andean mezcal and a bunch of other stuff like that. So that's a lot of what we're trying to do, is replicate some of the lessons from Runa, a lot of the mistakes, trying to learn from them, and then incubate these other enterprises. To me, the real question is always scale. And I think that's where a lot of people maybe mix up an approach, where I think there are certain things which it's just very difficult to see something scaling. And I think if you have too inflated expectations or investment models for something that the basic economics of the product or the ingredient or the usage or whatever just really can't scale, sort of applying these big vision investment ideas to never really works. At the same time, if you can really check those boxes of an ingredient which can be produced at scale, that has the right market fit, then these are things that require quite a bit of investment and quite a bit of attention. So our approach is to try and, in kind of a venture-ish model, take on maybe 10 new ingredients, assume that 6 of them probably aren't going to work out that well over a 3-year period. 2 or 3 will probably be okay and help out some communities, and hopefully one has some real scalable potential that could expand to hundreds and thousands of farmers.
Do you think that it needs to be sort of vertically integrated all the way to a finished product, or do you think there are investment models that can show returns even with, for example, just selling the raw ingredients, the goldenberries themselves, as opposed to a goldenberry product?
So that's something I have very strong opinions on, and also where I think a lot of people go a bit, I don't want to say off, but I think they choose an intentionally difficult model, which essentially is what we did. We chose a very difficult model where, probably a lot of us on the call know, building consumer brands is a very expensive and very challenging endeavor, regardless of complicating it with progressive supply chain practices and investment models. And that often takes a long time and lots of capital and just that whole game. And for us, we made the decision early on that we would wholesale guayusa to anyone who wanted to buy it, for kind of a long list of reasons, but partly, if we had a big company that said, I'll take a container of guayusa, the number of energy drinks we have to sell to use a container of guayusa is a lot of product and a ton of effort in terms of sales and marketing. So if you're really thinking about efficient impact, to me, it's very difficult to argue that a branded product play is more efficient in terms of getting volume from larger groups of farmers and moving it in the market. So I think on the supply chain side, it's much better to find buyers, whether it's wholesalers, brokers, brands, who want to leverage their existing brands, supply chains, commercial relationships, and then allow you to really focus on doing that sort of base work well. And again, it's not cheap in the first place to build these types of supply chains, so concentrating your resources there. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different models and ways of then creative funding and partnerships to get the commercial actors involved. I think having those existing commercial actors at the table can often unlock funding that otherwise wouldn't be there. Yeah, a lot. There's a lot there. Also, with a lot of this too, I just want to mention, if I forget later, that I love talking about all this, so I can put my email in the chat. So if people are working on cool stuff and I can share additional information, ideas, resources, etc., I'm more than happy to.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'm going to do one more question and then we'll do a quick little breakout. There is a particular aspect that you've noted here, which is the nonprofit for-profit working together, which is, I would say, a very small minority of brands out there take that route. I think there's perceptions that it's complicated, it's legally tricky, maybe there's some pitfalls to watch out for. How, I don't know, give us some like top 2 learnings that you got through running them in parallel. And yeah, what would you advise others take that route, or is it as complex as the agroforestry systems and growing the supply chain? And would you skip it or find an existing partnership? What do you recommend?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I would first say I think Runa was a pretty strange example for a bunch of reasons in that, and I don't think the most relevant one for most people. In terms of what I generally recommend, I rarely recommend a company start their own nonprofit. Rarely. It can be complex, for sure. The legality of it, if you manage it right and you're aware, is actually not the biggest impediment. It just adds another layer of complexity to an already complex model. And I think generally the reason to do it is much more PR driven than actually impact driven, in my experience. Even for example, early on when we had both organizations, for example, in Ecuador, we had both our Ecuadorian nonprofit and our Ecuadorian company. Most of the grant funding we got early on was to our Ecuadorian company, because some of these multilateral funders said, yeah, the whole nonprofit thing can be kind of like flimsy. You guys are a commercial actor doing clear commercial goals. We're going to give you free money to like give some fuel to you building a sustained supply chain, as opposed to some like short-term nonprofit project. So I think finding other partners is a more efficient way to go. And again, most of this work is supply chain investments. So, for us, like part of the reason I have nonprofits is, sure, if you had a donor who came to you and said, hey, I have $1 million to team up with you on the supply chain, but I'm only going to give it to a nonprofit, then yeah, like go register a 501c3 or get a physical sponsorship, get the $1 million and go do what you're going to do. But short of that, I think we made a lot of mistakes overcomplicating things. And I think just generally my approach to business, I try and just like simplify it as much as possible, more and more. So unless there's really some strong reason to have a second organization, generally I see it not adding value.
Awesome. Thank you for that clarity. So let's go with that first. Some people popped in questions before. There was one from Lauren about blowing up with indigenous crops. So Tyler, maybe you want to tackle that one a little.
I haven't done my full homework to really speak to this too in depth, but I've actually heard that from a few people who have that whole quinoa story about quinoa becoming too expensive for the Bolivian farmers actually was like a pretty misreported, incorrectly told fact that actually wasn't true and kind of caused a lot of ruckus that probably wasn't too accurate. So generally, I don't think that's that big of a problem at all. And I think, again, on the other side, like if some crop became so insanely valuable that the farmers, like, again, it's all voluntary, right? If even if a family said, I grow quinoa, I'm making so many gobs of thousands of dollars that I'm just going to sell all my quinoa. I mean, again, like there's likely sort of up and down cycles that could be pretty bad for, but on the whole, like, no one's coming and like stealing their quinoa and forcing them to sell it for $1,000 a kilo. So yeah, I think if anything, like we need more examples like that of crops that really get a lot of popular success and become in such high demand that they can trigger more investments and more attention and higher prices for farmers. Again, all within reason and not being exploited. In terms of reporting, Kevin asked about reporting. We spend a lot of time on reporting. And that's also part of the role that Aliados, our nonprofit, plays, even with some commercial partners, of basically putting in practice some of the like full M&E systems. We focus a lot on income and have all sorts of tools to track income changes over time, expenses, et cetera. Yeah, I'd be happy to share some tools and links and formats of people in more detail. But yeah, I think M&E is critical. I think especially to get partner funding and get some of the bigger multilateral funders and big foundations invested, having strong M&E is key. It's also something I see a lot of brands doing poorly, and actually I've talked to some other even bigger brands that I admire recently, that I think it can be easy to make like pretty unsubstantiated inflammatory claims. I see this a lot around conservation in particular, of people saying, yeah, we're conserving 100,000 hectares. And people are like, well, here, there's 100,000 hectares and we grow X crop here, and therefore we're conserving all of it. That's a pretty difficult claim to make. And again, there's ways that might be true depending on the system, but I think also attributing, that's another thing I think in terms of the claims people are often pretty cavalier on, and I've been guilty of it in the past as well, of saying we are conserving X, like we are saving Y. Generally speaking, most of us are contributing to the conservation of, as opposed to like we are the ones doing this. It's pretty rare that that's actually the case in this type of work. So I just would urge people to be like quite thoughtful around really knowing you can claim what you're claiming, and then making sure your language is sort of respectful and accurate in terms of what you're actually doing.
All right, thank you. Anybody else got a question? You can type it in the chat or raise your hand either with the little function, or you can just wave your hand. I'll probably see you. Other questions for Tyler? Amanda's got one. Go ahead, Amanda.
I guess talking a little bit about kind of the other products that you're now exploring and working in, it would be interesting to understand a little bit about when working with farmers, right? How do you, like, if I understand that with the last product you're working on, but maybe with these new products, does it ever get to a point where farmers are not wanting to embrace the diversified system, or how do you ensure that you're maintaining all of your farmers that intrinsic value of diversity within the system?
A lot of times it depends on the region and the group. I think that on the whole, most farmers don't want to be overly dependent on one thing. Especially the area of the world that we work in. Anyone who's been a coffee farmer in the last 20 years has, experienced like the pretty brutal effects of price collapse. So I think on the whole, they appreciate some diversity of income and like aren't looking to overly concentrate on any one thing. I think just is, again, Latin America, or at least where I've worked, and particularly in the indigenous cultures, like they tend to do many things. Like it's just their way of life. Like they hunt, they fish, they farm. So they're not really of this mindset of let me just do one thing and go all in and concentrate my resources. So I think that livelihood approach and economic approach generally translate pretty well to the types of crops they have and how they manage their land. Oftentimes as well, like they're pretty in tune with their land. Like they've either seen or know that they don't have some degree of trees, that it's going to lead to erosion, poor soil quality, like things which when we're all super distant, we need crazy amounts of research to be like, yeah, if you don't have trees, your soil is going to go to shit. Whereas for them, like they live and breathe it every day. And again, that's not always the case, but I would say on the whole, like it's not, in my experience, particularly hard to get farmers to be aware of and embrace diversification from both a land management and an economic livelihood approach.
There's a question here from Ben, that I think would be interesting to speak to. I'm going to jump in and make a quick comment on it. Just the focus, basically, if you could have built some of your chains and strategies differently with benefit of hindsight, how would you have done it? And I just want to put in from my regenerative systems perspective that supply chains don't exist. We call them chains. We all use the term chains for a number of reasons having to do with the history of putting people in chains to produce goods. But it's a funny little term. I mean, I use it too. I'm totally guilty of it, depending on who I'm talking with. But it's something interesting because it puts in our mind this image of a chain, like a single linear set of steps. And anyone who works in this space, it is actually more complex whole. It's more like a web or a network than the chain. But saying chains makes us keep thinking in a mechanistic way. And I'm putting out a little paper soon. I'll have a little more detail on that and what an alternative might be. So that's just a little comment. So Tyler, what your thought on strategies and chains, or if you want to think about them as systems, how would you have done it different?
Yeah, I'm with you on that refinement of the language. I think a big one for me is testing and learning, right? Like a lot of the things that we all apply in the consumer world applies on the supply chain side as well. You can launch a product that you just conceive of and don't test and throw a ton of money behind and see how it works. You can also get a minimum viable product, put it in a market, test the price, test the pack size, really figure out the recipe, and then take it step by step by step. And I think we didn't do that particularly well. I think we were kind of like overly aggressive and ambitious and not like really keen on, all right, we tried this. Is it working? Is it not? Let's try B. B worked better. Let's then try C. B worked better. Then let's do that for like the next step and the next step. Kind of all working towards something which is hopefully a lot more scalable, but not trying to just be like too aggro to get there quickly without recognizing that it's impossible not to miscalculate a bunch of variables early on. So I think that just like early testing is one piece of it. I think the tricky thing really practically, and probably people thought about this, and I'm even dealing with this right now, for example, where we're also working on this Amazonian cinnamon supply chain. This rare, super cool Amazonian cinnamon that I'm formulating in this product that we're launching for Nestle and Terrafertil. And like just that, like super smart, one co-op, get it, the whole deal. But partly to enter our supply chain, they need to have, and they really should have at some SQF level to be able to qualify it in terms of our ingredient, QC protocols, but at the very least GMP. So then it's like, okay, well, then you got to layer on a whole GMP process minimum for a co-op you're only trying to buy like 20 kilos of cinnamon from to start. And I don't necessarily have the best recipe for that, but I would just more focus on that, like understanding what minimum viable level is, whether it's GMP, whether it's SQF, and then trying to just be super targeted to get those minimum viable pieces. For us, for example, like maybe one example, we did tons of research around leaf harvesting that was more thinking like 15 years down the line in year 2. When in reality, like there's a couple things like that we just were like, oh, but we need to understand this level. And in reality, it was like, we don't. We needed to do A, B, and C, and we were on like P and Q that we wasted money on. Whereas if we would have just made sure we got to D, and D was really critical for that QC, that we could have saved time and effort just to get exactly that set of things to then get to the kind of minimum viable product for the market. So
excellent. That's great. Let's go to Philip's question, which is right in that same vein, tension and decision. How many leaves to remove from a plant? Is there some tension there? Income today versus income source ongoing. What's that like for Guayusa?
Yeah, I mean, without in too much detail, it's not an area of ton of concern. And again, it's farmer management. If they were to strip all the leaves off and kill a tree, like ultimately it's on them. We're talking about millions of trees, and it would just be not the wisest strategy from their side. So we didn't see that as a big problem for the most part.
Cool. So there's a couple questions here, and then I'm going to pass it to Kevin, who's got his hand up. But these two in here, there's sort of questions about climate change. Is climate change a concern for farmers? And then this other question is basically like, is it important to be networking farmers with people in other regions as sort of disruptions occur? I also just want to say, I don't believe there are any such thing as regenerative practices in and of themselves. There's regenerative outcomes, but practices can go in many different ways. You don't know the outcome till it's done. But anyway, I think the point of this question is a really good one. To what extent do you need to connect farmers to each other, to be learning from each other, and then combine that with the sort of climate. And is climate change important to these farmers?
Climate change is definitely important. Yeah, for sure. I mean, more in the Andes than in the Amazon. Again, as far as I understand, like the sort of eminent impacts of climate is more severe likely for the Andean farmers than the Amazonian farmers, at least right now. Yeah, networking is big. We, early on, some of the grant funding we got, we actually took a group of farmers down to see Guayaquil, and those guys who were, super awesome and embraced us and showed us, the mate industry and their supply chains, value webs. We also then brought them to the coast where there's a lot more developed cooperatives and cooperative management structures. Yeah, so we did a good bit of that for exchange and trading of ideas. I'm a huge believer in that. I think it can be quite helpful.
Yeah, awesome. All right, Kevin, I think I just asked you to unmute there.
Yeah, hi. I thank you very much, Tyler, for this. Just as a quick background, Terrafertil, we've been working with smallholder farmers in West Africa for about 7 years. And some of the issues that keep coming back to us are some of the, how do we ensure that we're not coming across as the all-knowing, and that we're just kind of finding these opportunities. So I guess the question I have is have you put any type of traceability or transparency program in place, like a blockchain, to show the absolute provenance of your products through, and transparency of the value chain, and also profit sharing? Like, because a lot of the times, products that we pay for products are kind of dictated down there, and then they get value added, and then finally they end up in a product here. And people along that chain are really seeing the financial impacts. And I was wondering if there's a formula where money goes back to the farmers, that's from the value added that occurs down the chain. And also, is there a formalization way of tracking the actual community and family uplifting of the benefits in those communities as a result of them participating in a value web or value chain down the road? What are your thoughts on that?
So on the first part, we haven't used blockchain yet. It's something we've started to think about, but by no means advanced or intelligent about. But I think there's opportunities. We have traceability. So if you pull the can of Runa, we could then trace it back through the lot to see what groups of farms went into that batch that was processed in the factory. It's impossible to say the leaves in this can came from that one farm, because there's different blending and batching that happens, but we can absolutely trace it back as closely as possible. The second part of the question around pricing and profit sharing. So we guarantee a fixed minimum price, fixed fair trade price to farmers that we just set and have kept. And part of that, again, think about coffee, is so that there wasn't the risk of it going down. We always could pay higher, but basically contractually committed to not lowering the price. We never found a great model in terms of then cycling back ultimate profits down for many reasons. Part of it for us is we were a growth startup beverage company, so we were not remotely close to profitable in the first place. And once you kind of get into that side of the business, translating that kind of, especially early stage growth company financials and metrics and sales back into the farmer side, I'm sure there's ways it probably could be done, but we never necessarily figured it out. We did two creative things though. When Leonardo DiCaprio invested in Runa in one of our rounds, and we came up with this cool idea with him where he invested cash, and then rather than giving him the shares, we then gave his shares, we donated the shares to the National Federation of the Indigenous Communities, and essentially put a seed of equity in their hands to then have part of the ownership pool that then grew and then could create broader benefit. It's tricky when you get in individual community or supplier levels, because if that changes over time, it can be difficult. We also, the Ecuadorian national government invested in the company, in our Ecuadorian company, and part of the deal with them was that we had to then transition and or sell 10% of their shares directly to the communities or regional nonprofits, which is kind of its whole mess and challenge. But I think there's things like that that can be well-intentioned there, that again might not have the ultimate vision of impact ultimately, but ways to sort of break up some of those pieces. And the third part of your question, I am now forgetting. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
The actual tracking of like OECD metrics, tracking the community improvement as a result of this social economic benefit that the farmers are
we'll just
participate in, that we can actually go track and say, okay, maternal health is improved, equality between men and women is improved, people are now putting more kids in school, for example, that type of stuff.
Yeah, we'll just take that along with that last question from Max there of how has this impact reporting been important for you? And so if not those, then, you know, which metrics have you reported? And we'll probably wrap on that.
Yeah, and again, I'm happy to share more in detail offline. Again, income's really the primary thing, you know, for us, and it's not just gross income, but income changes over time is the clearest metric. And again, in terms of some of the questions around communication, like we can directly say we're doing that. You know, we put millions of dollars of direct cash in people's pockets, and we can, without a doubt, say that we are doing that and we have done that. So I think cash tends to be the main thing we focus on and track closely, and then gross income per family. And the research is clear, you know, like Poor Economics is a great book if people haven't read it, but the research is pretty clear that if you put cash in farmers' hands, that improves livelihoods. So we stood behind that research quite a bit. In terms of other key metrics, women's representation at the leadership levels of the co-ops is another metric that we focused on, and, you know, went from like, I'm not going to give the numbers precisely, but 5% initially to like 60% now. And a couple other miscellaneous ones. Yeah, those would be the main ones. And again, I'm happy to share some of the surveys and reports and whatnot if people want to see those.
Awesome. Okay, thank you very much, Tyler, for your time and great insights today. And then please join us for the upcoming talks in the coming weeks. Thanks again, Tyler. Look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Ethan.